the Sanditon Chronicles. I'm your host, Maureen, and we are here with Janice today. And we are switching up a bit. We have no more recaps, of course, which is sort of depressing, but we're going to have them soon to go over, so not so sad. Today we're talking about parallels and ironies in Sanditon. And Janice has done her homework on this today.
I have, and you know what? I had not saying I've got all of them by any stretch of the imagination, but it's amazing when you start really looking at them, how many there are. I mean, even within a conversation, you'll see it.
Mm-hmm.
So do you want to start with the parallels? I have fewer of those written down.
Yeah, let's do some of those.
Okay, so I think it's really interesting in episode 1 that Charlotte arrives in the carriage along the sea's edge with the Parkers and then leaves in episode 8 in the same outfit, alone in the carriage.
Yeah.
You know, of
in
course,
the first, she's very excited and happy. In the last, she's crying and heartbroken.
Yep. But, you know, they kept that consistency of what she was wearing and what the view was. And also Charlotte meets Sydney as he arrives along the sea's edge. And of course, we know Sydney comes and stops her carriage to say goodbye. Yeah.
And so, I mean, as much as we are complaining that we didn't get the right ending, we didn't get an ending, they still did close it up in that. They brought it full circle from beginning to end. It ties in well enough that it could have just ended there. Well, that's not what it wanted.
Right. And if it wasn't for the fans, it probably would have.
Yeah, exactly.
Obviously, ITV thought it was just fine to be done.
Yeah. And I think that it's interesting to see those two polar opposite things, because we see her full of hope, and I don't think she's lost hope in the end. No, but she's definitely been changed and altered by the same seashore. That it's almost like the sea has been a main character throughout this, and that same sea that she travels along to get there is the same sea she's traveling along as she goes home, but it's the sea itself has changed her so much.
Oh yeah, definitely.
And it's been witness to every single painful and glad thing that she's experienced while she's been there.
And a little bit like, you know, the sea going in and out. And I always think, you know, this whole story a lot of it is about, you know, a fall from innocence.
Yeah.
She entered as a very innocent young woman. And I just always think about her father's words when he says, be careful. And she's like, well, surely nothing could go wrong. Yeah. You know, anyway.
Doesn't he say everything can go wrong?
Yeah, exactly. He said, look out for everything. Yeah. And then in episode 2, the way that, still in episode 1, how Charlotte and Esther go for the walk again, as you said, along the sea. And Esther's comment, all in all, I think you will come to regret ever setting foot in Sanditon.
I know I do.
And then in episode 8, when Mary questions her, I hope you don't regret coming to Sanditon. Yeah. So, yeah, again, a parallel in terms of, you know, their thoughts about Charlotte and her journey in Sanditon.
And the parallel there too also stems from Charlotte, because when Esther's saying it to her, Charlotte is seeing freedom in Sanditon. She's seeing there's no way I could possibly regret coming here. But in episode 8, she has so much that she could regret. She doesn't, I don't think. But I think that there's a lot to regret that is possible to regret. There's the loss of Sydney. There's the loss of these friendships. I mean, she knows Sydney's a part of this family. She can never go back the same way that she came in because the brother is, you know, that's a hard thing. So they've just done so well interweaving those things and making them altered yet still the same.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And, you know, just the different approaches. And she does say how could she regret it? It's the greatest adventure of her life. You know?
And she says it through tears and heartbreak.
Yeah. And then in episode 2, the way that Lady Denham treats Georgiana is as rotten as the pineapple Arthur opens. I always think that's quite the parallel, but how she treats her and how rotten the pineapple is.
Yeah. And even the way Arthur says it's rotten, Lady Denham, to the core. Like he's just so surprised it could be that dead all the way through. And I think that I think that that's what I don't think Lady Denham was rotten in that she's a horrible person. I think that, and I think she was certainly acting like she was a horrible person, but I don't think and we've done one on her last week. So, I mean, you guys are familiar with my viewpoint on that, but it was the idea that she was almost like dead inside.
Right.
It was all business. It was all works. There was nothing else to her. And it took, funnily enough, Charlotte to bring her back to life, from being dead inside to being brought back to life.
And to stand up to her enough for her to recognize her behavior.
Yeah.
You know? It's in that conversation where Lady D says, I suppose you thought I didn't treat her well.
Yeah. Yeah. And even when Charlotte stands up to her, it's that idea of Lady Denham saying, I like people who speak their mind. I like strong people, but don't speak your mind because strong people annoy me. And so she's these both people at the same time, which is just an oxymoron to be. And Charlotte is able to challenge both of those at once.
Yeah, that's right. And it's so built into her nature. It's not like she could not do it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And then also in chapter 2, when Charlotte describes her situation as well, when she describes Georgiana being far from home and without friends, when she's talking to Lady D, you know, she's describing herself as well as Georgia.
Yeah.
And that's quite the parallel.
And it's crazy because Charlotte didn't know anybody coming there. She was friendless, but because of who she was, she had friends, even though she was far from home, had never met these people before. They protected her in a way that Georgiana didn't receive protection, even though they had been there the same length of time, came in the same way, and no one was protecting Georgiana, but they were there to protect Charlotte.
And also, look at the parallel between the way that Sydney treated her in that first ball, and you know, was similar to what Georgiana went through at the pineapple luncheon.
Yeah,
you know, very similar.
Don't think that's a lot of the reason that they don't get along is because they are such similar personalities. Although Sydney's not as bratty as she is, but still, in generals, they are very similar people.
Right. And then when Charlotte walks up from the beach, apparently having gone sea bathing in episode 2, and she unexpectedly finds, and then how we've talked about this before, how she unexpectedly finds Sydney sea bathing at the very end of the episode. So there's those parallels to the beginning and end of the episode.
I feel like they slip us into every episode, something to work for. And it almost, the way they work their parallels from beginning to end, whether it's in an episode or whether it's from episode 1 to episode 8, there's this building sense of anticipation the entire series. Because you just know that there's something that's more, somehow they worked it in. You don't know that the parallel is coming until you binge watched it several times. But even while watching it for the first time, there's this anticipation that builds and builds and builds because of how they wrote that. And they wrote it with these parallels built into every episode. Yes.
Well, and I was just looking again because they were talking about on Twitter, there was a little post about going back and re-looking at some of the Q&As, especially Justin, the writer, Justin Young's Q&A from earlier, and how he, you know, he wrote those 4 episodes, but in interesting order. You know, he wrote 4, then 3, then 6, then 7.
Oh, really?
4, yeah. Oh, or 7, then 6. Anyway, he wrote them in a real interesting order, and so I'm sure he is very aware of all of this. He didn't do 1 and 2, but he did. And
sometimes it's the easier way to, sometimes when I'm writing a story out, I'll think of what I want to happen at the end, and I'll build backwards. So I can make sure that every step of the way is building. And that's what you can sense that from this. It's building up. And it's a really interesting way to write it, but it also makes it so that you keep your reader engaged as you work backwards.
Oh yeah, definitely. The next one I wrote down was in episode 6, and I'm sure I've missed some in between, but I have a lot of ironies. So I have a lot of ironies. Sydney demonstrated how much he appreciates and how much he heard Charlotte, what Charlotte had to say when he takes action and repeats her words back to her. For instance, when she says in episode 4, I thought they deserved a proper parting. And then in episode 6, he says he decided to bring Otis back to meet with Georgiana because a good man shouldn't be condemned for one terrible mistake, which she had said also in episode 6.
But in episode 6, he also says, I thought they deserved a proper goodbye.
Right. I'm sorry. Yeah, that's exactly right. That's what he says.
But in the carriage in episode 6, she does say a good man shouldn't be condemned for one thing. And then he does repeat that back later in episode 6.
Yeah. Right. Which is both a parallel and an irony.
Yeah.
So there, and we've talked before in chapter 8 how there's parallels about what happens at chapter 7, there's parallels about what happens at the regatta, between the going back and forth that Sydney does between Eliza and Charlotte. And those are just as much ironies as parallels, but there's definitely a lot of that. There are other parallels you're thinking of before we go into irony?
There's a couple. There's you look at the Parker family compared to the Denham family, and Lady Denham holds herself so high above, but then you look at Parker family, that family is all in Sanditon trying to make money, and Sanditon trying to get money off of this. That's the reason Sidney invested. He would like Sanditon to work well because he'll stand to profit richly, as Tom says, if it succeeds. You have Arthur, who is there to help his brother make this a success. Then you look at Denham's family. Lady Denham herself wants this town to be profitable because she's put her money in there. Edward and Esther need it to be profitable because they want their aunt's money and they want to continue making money. So both of those families parallel each other as they walk step by step. It's just the heads of those families are a little bit different, but even in that, they're very similar. Lady Denham is ridiculous in that the pineapple tasting and saying he had the audacity to handle my pineapple. She's that sort of ridiculous. But then you look at Tom and how he's ridiculous. I'm going to buy my wife a 1,000-pound necklace when I can't afford to pay my men. That's his form of ridiculous. And so they're very, very similar, yet in different ways. And their families are in line doing the same thing, making same decisions that are harmful to those around them. And the other, of course, the biggest one is at the first ball on the balcony where Sydney's haranguing her of how dare you say these things, and you have no perceptions, to episode 8 on the same balcony. I didn't deserve those things. No, I did deserve them. And so you have that parallel of what the things he said there, even though they were true, the roughness with them, redeeming it in episode 8. And I think that's what a lot of the parallels are about in this, is redeeming those situations.
No, you're right.
Those characters,
especially between those two.
And then there's, of course, when he tells her in episode 4, when he's like, you speak out of turn. But then later on, he's asking for her opinion on things and saying how much it matters. So there's all these ways that they've used these parallels as a tool, not only to show redemption, but also to show the brokenness and the pain that's underneath it. That's what makes you want to dig into these characters and find out where did that come from? What did you experience that made you feel that way? Because they've used this as a tool to show you that there's something more below that surface.
Yeah, no, I agree totally. It's, I started watching a little bit of episode 5 again a little while ago, and it was like, I love it every single time. And one of the parallels, the underlying parallels that aren't verbal and is the music, and the way that they built it so that music shows up, when certain characters show up, and creates parallels in and of itself. And it controls your emotions. And that's one of the things that makes the show just so incredible.
Yeah, absolutely. And then there's also the first dance to the last dance, where in the first dance, it's all about new beginnings, meeting each other for the first time. There's confrontations that happen there between Clara and Charlotte and Edward. There's all these things that are happening that are good, that are progressing, that are showing, that are furthering along the story. And then you have episode 8, where the dance brings an end to so many different things. There's Edward and Esther, they bring the end to that. They bring an end to Sydney and Charlotte. They bring an end to the flirtation between Babington and Esther, because it's solidified that rather than ending it and cutting it off, it's ended their flirtation and entered them into a new beginning. So it's, you have these two dances that are with the same amount of fervor, the same amount of pomp and circumstance that Tom puts into it, but they're bringing about very different things in those storylines.
Yeah, they're kind of bookends.
Yeah.
Yeah. The balls are very instrumental.
Yeah.
In they're put in at particular times for particular purposes. And yeah, it's pretty amazing. So do you want to talk about ironies?
Yes, let's dig in.
Okay. So in episode 1, Mary thanks Charlotte for her help out of the overturned carriage versus Tom, who doesn't need help, but then proceeds to sprain his ankle. It's ironic, how that happens.
I love Chris Marshall in that scene.
I know. Well, I love both of them. Kate Ashfield's face when she comes up out of the carriage is priceless. I don't know how many times they shot that scene, but that was just wonderful. And then Tom too, and it's funny.
His scream is like stuck in my head.
Yeah. Yeah, which it would make you scream too, wouldn't it?
That sound is terrible, that cracking sound. Whoa.
I know, and it was added later, but it's very effective. They have it timed very well.
Exactly. That is, I like that they right off the gate, because I think Jane Austen likes to write in ironies. She likes to write in parallels. She likes to write in things that are the way they are, but shouldn't be the way they are by expectation. That's how she writes her stories. That's how she gets writers hooked. And I think that they carried that through really well. And I like that they opened this up on that. And they stuck with that part of her story.
And she, in her book, wrote this opening scene, but in a slightly different way.
Yeah.
I mean, I love the way that the cinematographer took it. A lot of it is the director and the cinematographer and how they chose to film it.
Yeah.
But yeah. And of course she was writing a book, as opposed to a screenplay.
Exactly. And I think too that with Tom, another sort of irony there is he was so absolutely certain of where he was going, what he was doing, but what he was about to do was so uncertain in so many different ways. How can you be so sure of something that there's no certainty to it? And
he was so certain and so wrong.
Yeah.
About the lane they were going down. And
that is something I loved about the book a little bit better than the movie, is when Tom was trying to convince Mr. Hayward, no, this is where the doctor is. And Mr. Hayward kept saying, I've lived here my whole life. There's nobody here like that. Yes, there is. No, there's not.
Yeah, it's funny. It really is. Yep, I agree with you. And of course, also another thing in episode 1 is it's just so ironic when he's like telling them all about why he was looking for this physician. And then when Charlotte says, is that a relative? Sanditon, all this poor Sanditon, is that a relative? The humorous moments are great that way. And then Mr. Haywood warns Charlotte about the seaside resort and to be careful of everything. We talked about that a little bit.
Yeah.
And then versus episode 6, when she goes to London to find the kidnapped Georgiana, and not knowing where exactly what happened. And, so you kind of think along with her when she's going to the seaside town with the Parkers, well, what kind of trouble is she going to get into? You might be romantic, but you're not thinking physical. And then all of a sudden she's thrown into physical danger.
Yeah.
So
by her own making. And she was saying to him, even surely with them, I could get into any trouble, but it's her who gets into trouble because she takes herself out of their safety net and goes to where it is unsafe all of her own.
Because she feels so responsible for what's happened with Georgiana.
Yeah.
And that's why. And, I did look up something I think you might find interesting. That phrase, shuffle off this mortal coil, it's a phrase from what is perhaps the most famous soliloquy in all of Shakespeare's plays, or in fact, in a Renaissance play. Hamlet, written around 1602, is in that play. The wording was, the word coil had never been used in Shakespeare before. And since then, it's become a synonym for the body, That's how she was using it.
Mm-hmm.
The main character uses it in his soliloquy about whether or not to commit suicide.
Mm-hmm.
That makes calamity of so long life, And so, yeah, I just think of her talking when she first, when Lady D first comes into Trafalgar House and meets Charlotte and says they're all waiting for me to shuffle off this mortal coil. And I just thought, where did that phrase come from?
Yeah.
Well, it's Shakespeare, and he just wrote it in 1602.
The fact that she pulled something from Shakespeare shows you her education, how smart she is.
I don't know if she used that phrase or if that was just Andrew Davies that used it, but regardless,
I don't remember what she said in the book, but yeah.
She could have said it, but
But I mean, her education was such that she did read other things, and she did read things that a typical woman of that time didn't read.
Yeah. Yeah, she was very well read.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So also in episode 1, Esther's evaluation of the Parker brothers versus Charlotte's observations with Sydney on the balcony. Kind of ironic, the differences. I mean, they were somewhat similar, but as we talked before, Esther's view was much more negative, and Charlotte was just talking about, like, for instance, on Arthur, the contrast in that he would sometimes be very outgoing, gregarious, and other times was a hypochondriac. She didn't put it that way, but that's he. And of course, he had a sister that wanted him to not do much of anything, but which is also ironic.
Yeah.
And then in comparing those views, what Esther had to say and what Charlotte said to Sydney with Mary's view of Sydney, how Mary felt about Sydney, there's an irony there, especially compared to Esther's view that he was quite dangerous. And
she proved to be right. And Esther, I mean, her words were harsh, but she was not far off from her discernment.
Right. Yeah. He was especially dangerous at the ball.
Yeah. And the danger there too is the amount of women that would, for Charlotte at least, she could very easily fall into love with him when he clearly is unable to make his own choices when it comes to wedding and love. He had to think of his family and put his family first. That was the obligation he had set on him by his family. And that was a very real danger, as shown by her leaving in tears and heartbroken at the end of episode 8.
Yeah, he was put in an impossible situation, I think.
But I think in that time, especially when your family is suffering, you put your family above yourself. That's what you do. It doesn't just save your family, but it also saves you and your reputation. So it's about family reputation. It's about you as much as it is about anybody else. And I think that for him, he was not free to make his own choices.
No.
And for Charlotte to be that close to him and fall in love with him, there was a very real danger to that.
And in huge contrast to how we are now.
Yeah.
I mean, yes, people end up homeless, but they don't end up in jail because of the debt, Not
always, no.
Yeah. Not usually. And also in episode 1, I knew you would be interested in this, and I'm sure you've already talked about it. The way that Sydney holds himself when dancing with Charlotte at the first ball versus the demeanor he has in episode 6 when dancing with her.
Yeah.
That was a huge contrast.
Yeah. And I think too, like he was intrigued by her in that first dance. And we've talked a little bit about that. He was very intrigued by her. He wanted to know more of this woman. He wanted to understand who this woman was, who cared more about his thoughts than who he was or what he had. And then you see that in episode 6 amplified to the point of devotion rather than just intrigue.
Right. Yeah. He pursues her and, yeah. And just the little things like the way he holds her hand.
Yeah.
in episode 6 versus 1.
And the irony there is that the first moment that he allows himself to give himself over to how he feels for Charlotte and to really submit to that feeling of love and devotion he has for her is the very same moment that Eliza shows up.
Yep, that's when she appears.
Ugh.
And also when Sydney he dressed down Charlotte after he asked her opinion,
Yeah.
on the balcony. And then in episode 8, on the balcony at the Midsummer Ball, when he apologized, was you already mentioned, and talks about just what a brute he was. And you can tell is on the verge of proposing.
Yeah.
Something and just the difference in his demeanor in both places, it's pretty amazing.
Yeah. From offense to humbled.
Yeah. Episode 2, when Charlotte and Esther's their both of their reactions and how ironic it is with the flower sermon. I call it the flower sermon.
Oh my gosh, I always forget about that.
Versus Mrs. Griffith's response. I mean, like, okay, are you guys listening to the same sermon? And obviously, I think it's a difference of listening on a deeper level. And as opposed to just the surface, which is what obviously Mrs. Griffiths was doing.
And Mrs. Griffiths was really trying to get married.
Yeah, it would have seemed so. Yeah. And then episode 2, when Clara tells Lady Denham, but then you are always thinking of bringing pleasure to others about the pineapple luncheon. And versus Mary's reaction to the invitation, and quite uncharacteristic of Lady Denham. I wonder what she's up to.
And of course, Clara is saying it with bite, but still the fact that Lady Denham's like, oh, I know.
Yeah, yes. But the difference in just their approaches,
Yeah.
Kind of funny. So I also, and especially in light of the way Lady D treats her guest of honor, Miss Georgiana Lamb, to have Clara say what she does. Obviously, Mary was much more in tune with the truth. And,
I wouldn't say, because Clara knew that that's not really how she was. Clara was just trying to butter her up.
Oh, yeah, that's right. But I'm just saying the difference in the words.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so it's interesting, obviously in episode 2, they talked about the Antigua black pineapple. I didn't realize it was called Antigua black, that particular pineapple. Have you read about it?
No, I figured that from this, I understood that's what it meant, but I didn't know anything about it.
Well, so I got to think, I just wanted to make sure I understood, especially Georgiana's words, and it said it was the signature fruit of Antigua. The Antigua black pineapple is known world round for the sweetest and rarest variety there is. At least it was then. Don't let the name fool you. These pineapples are as perfectly golden as the ones you've seen before, if not more so. So evidently they still are, like, it sounds like the queen of pineapples.
Oh, wow.
And it has been cultivated on the southern side of the island since 1640. So they've been around a long time. So that's why her comments about, well, ain't no Antigua black. So she was really putting Lady D down as much as Lady D was putting her down. It was like, this isn't a good one,
Yeah. And I think too, the fact that Lady Denham went through, whether or not she's just naturally that knowledgeable, or she did research to find out more about Antigua, to have something there that's familiar to her, to try to, that shows that she's trying to be kind, or she's pulling something from her background that she'd be familiar with. But then the words that she says are so far from kind while they're at that dinner table. Whether or not she's set off by what Georgiana says, it doesn't matter. The juxtaposition there between her intent with making her a guest of honor, of making sure that there's something from her home that's there, even if it's not the right flavor, the right style, but it is still a pineapple specific, to her country. So she's doing all these things that seem kind, to the point that Mary stepped off that, well, that's weird. but that
Yeah,
her words are so unkind through that whole thing. And I
right.
mean, there's even a point where I yell at my TV whenever I'm watching the episode. What are you trying to accomplish right now? Like,
Yeah.
talking to her that way is not going to get you anything that you say you want.
Well, I know. And obviously she did the luncheon and brought the pineapple in to try and win Georgiana for Edward,
Yeah.
you know, that was a complete disaster.
Yeah. And from the
Yeah.
beginning, not only because Georgiana and Edward wouldn't mix, but because of the way Lady D spoke to Georgiana the whole time.
Right. Yeah.
Like she thought that me doing this enough for you, me showing you the effort I put in to bring her home, that should be enough. I shouldn't have to be nicer beyond that.
And you should be dying to be hooked up with this man with a title, you know.
With a leaky roof and a title.
Yeah. Yeah. And actually earlier in chapter 2, of course, the irony of Charlotte's attempt to apologize to Sydney. And then I said, I hope you won't think of the badly of me.
Mm-hmm.
And then his rude reaction to her at that time, I don't think of you at all, versus episode 8, when Sydney stops Charlotte. This is both an irony and a parallel in the departing carriage and says, tell me you don't think too badly of me. And Charlotte says, I don't think badly of you.
Mm-hmm.
The irony.
And there too, it's when he says, I don't think of you at all. He actually, all he can do is think about her.
Right. It's a lie.
Yeah. And there's that scene in Becoming Jane. It's about Jane Austen's, it's very loose biography on her. And it's where the character of Jane Austen says, irony is, what is it? It's hard truth with a smile.
Yeah.
Or I shall count it false. And that's kind of what he's doing here, because he's trying not to think about her. So he's, by sheer force of will, trying not to think about her. But the fact that he has to force himself not to think about her means he's thinking about her all the time. Whereas in episode 8, when he says that to her and she responds, I don't think badly of you, she's also at the same point he was, where she can't help but think of him, but it's painful to think about him. Where before it was painful to not think about her, but he didn't. It's painful for her to think about him, but she's going to.
Right. Yeah. And I love her words back at him, because she just says how absolutely awful he was being to her.
Yeah.
I mean, anyway,
she's the best parts of his character.
Oh yeah.
Because she says what he was actually thinking and feeling, which are kind and affectionate, but he was too afraid because of his brokenness to say.
Yeah, that's right. And then it's so funny that Sydney has no time for Dr. Fuchs, but is the first to think of him.
Yeah.
And when old Stringer is hurt, to have someone get help from him.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, he didn't have time to watch all of that, but he was good at drawing on the resources available.
Mm-hmm. And he didn't have time for Dr. Fuchs, but he was awfully close to where Charlotte was as she wandered around the town.
Yeah.
So you gotta kind of wonder, you don't have time for this demonstration. What were you doing?
Yeah. So Tom, who worries constantly, tells Mary that she worries far too much.
Yeah.
That's definitely the case.
What all Tom does is worry every moment of every day, to the point where he tells his brother, I am beset with worries.
Right, exactly. And then when Sydney, this is also in episode 3, who seems to be Charlotte's biggest detractor, becomes her biggest champion for the idea of the regatta, which Tom, of course, takes credit for. Lots of irony there.
And he says, surely Charlotte deserves some credit.
Yeah, exactly.
Not all?
Yeah. And then the irony when they're walking on the beach and we begin to realize how much Sydney takes to heart Charlotte's words, even when he appears not to pay any mind to them, when he says, is it conceivable that we have had each other wrong?
Yeah.
And also when she says, when she goes to get the children for tea and they're racing the boats, and she said, they're going, well, the red boat has to win, whichever one had to win. because the blue boat had to win because it was a matter of history, historical fact. And she's like, can we not rewrite our history if we find it disagreeable? You know, that's pretty ironic, that statement.
Yeah. Especially since it's his history that comes back that he has to end up being with, but is miserable because he's going back into his history.
Yeah, in order to save his family. Yeah. And then in episode 3, when Georgiana tells Sydney that she will try to behave better as Sydney's leaving, and then immediately turns around and writes Otis to come to Sanditon.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Immediately. And all the things she said, I'm going to try to be better. Me too. Yeah. And then they both, it's not just both of them. It's, he said, I'm going to try to be better too. She turns around and writes Otis, but he immediately jumps to conclusions when he sees them back there, and he gets in a big fight with Charlotte and then says, I'm going to leave. So they both have almost immediately gone against their word.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And in episode 4, this one really cracks me up. And I know we talked about it when we were doing the recap, but when Mrs. Griffiths describes picnics as the preserve of farmhands and savages, and it is an invitation to licentiousness for a young lady to be seated on the ground whilst eating in full view of anybody who might pass. It's just undignified, Miss Haywood. It's ungodly. And then in episode 5, when she is perfectly happy sitting in pillows on the ground, eating fruit at the cricket match. What is that? Not a picnic?
And it's okay because the man she's trying to attract, who can see her with her skirts up, is Reverend Hankins.
Yeah,
it's only okay. It's only okay when the Reverend is there to spy her laying on the ground at a picnic.
But it's just like,
ridiculous.
Really ridiculous.
And the fact that it was only seen as licentious and ungodly until she found out the Parkers were going to be there, and then it's oh no, totally fine, go ahead. Parkers, why didn't you tell me the Parkers are going to be there? Of course you can go on a picnic if they're going to be there.
And again, this is Georgiana lying,
yes,
but anyway,
but what about having wealthy patrons there makes it godly as opposed to ungodly? There's no reason to it other than just being difficult.
Yep, that's right. And then when Georgiana isn't worried about getting caught with Otis because she believes Sydney is in London, when ironically he returns even as she says that.
Yeah.
And they do such a great job in the filming of it.
The irony there too is that she lied to Charlotte because she needed Charlotte to hide Otis, but the reason Sydney came back was to be with Charlotte again.
I know.
And that's why he came back early. So the very person Georgiana was using to lie to and to get her to be with Otis is the very reason that Sydney came back early and found her with Otis.
And they got in a fight.
Yeah.
And Georgia was put in an impossible. Charlotte was put in an impossible position.
What?
Charlotte was put in an impossible position. Yes. Yeah. And then in episode 4, when Edward tells Lady Denham that even Babington's bound to give up sooner or later in pursuit of Esther, which only encourages Lady D to promote the relationship, which ironically Edward didn't want. It's pretty amazing.
And that would be because Babington is a decent dude who's not going to let Esther be controlled by Edward anymore. So of course Edward wants nothing for her that is good and nothing for her that will take him out of the picture completely. He wanted her to be with a bumbling buffoon who was rich and would let Edward do whatever he wanted.
But obviously if he hadn't made those comments to Lady D to get her to quit looking at him,
exactly,
she would have never known. And also in episode 4, I found a lot in episode 4. Charlotte decides to help Georgiana and do what Sydney has accused her of. It is ironic, and because she really hadn't been doing that prior to Sydney blowing up, and also it doesn't hurt that Georgiana and Otis opened her eyes to a lot of things, but also misled her. About Sydney.
And the other thing there too is that Sydney was telling her, you have a misconception of me, but he is the reason she has this misconception in episode 4, because it's his outburst and his seemingly biased, completely biased reaction to this apparently innocent man that without explanation that has set her off to be like, well, fine, I'm going to do what I told you I wouldn't do, because clearly you're not who you said you were. So I'm going to be who I want to be, regardless of what you want.
And they led her to believe that she was still benefiting from slavery, and that he was, it was just that he was being a racist, basically.
Yeah. And I do feel like Otis knew more than what he said, because he was, when Georgiana would say this stuff, Georgiana said it because she's immature and she's spiteful. But Otis let it play out that way because it benefited him in the moment.
Oh, right. Yeah, absolutely. So then in episode 5, when they are conniving and she brings her that book on self-control, which by Mary Brunton, which was written in 1611. And she says, oh, it's a self-help book or something like self-improvement book.
Yeah.
And yeah, couched in, I read about it, and it's couched in a lot of stories about scandal and all kinds of things that young girls would enjoy reading, I'm sure. And they were moral lessons. That's how, it was put there. And I guess Jane Austen is a lot of the reason why she wrote Sense and Sensibility, and as a answer back to the book Self-Control, that it was
wow, I didn't realize that.
Yeah, that's what this article I read said. And it said that she made a comment about the book, I think before she wrote Sense and Sensibility, and about how the stuff in the book wasn't probable or natural or whatever. And so she put together Sense and Sensibility, which, was what's the word, more reasonable in terms of the people's reactions. And so having not read Self-Control, I can't tell you for sure, but I think Sense and Sensibility is pretty good about making us look at how our behavior affects others. Absolutely.
And I think too that right there, I'm trying to look up who wrote episode 5.
It was written, episode 5 was written by Lisa Clark, I believe.
She's the director.
She was the director. Who wrote it?
I thought it would be an easy thing to look up, but then they're just giving me recaps of episode 5. I know what episode 5 is. But of course, the irony there is that she's reading a book on self-control, and that makes Lady Griffith or Mrs. Griffiths happy while they're doing something that is completely out of control.
Right. That's right.
They're hiding right in plain sight with what they're doing.
Exactly. Yeah. And so, of course, we could talk a lot about Tom and the workman and what happened there. The irony of that. Is there anything in particular you want to feature on that?
No, I think that there's just a lot.
Yeah. And then it's ironic at the end, in a way, it's ironic that when he finds out what's going on, and obviously he can tell she knows something about what's going on, that what she intended to be, this sweet little innocent thing turns into a kidnapping, basically. And that he gets really mad at her, and unbeknownst to him, she makes the decision that she's going to London to try and put things right.
Yeah. The one thing I would say about the workers and Tom before we move on to the next episode is that for the amount that he worries about what he does not have to pay his workers, because he is worried about the workers' pay. That's one of the first things he says to Sydney on a consistent basis is, I don't have the money to pay my workers. I don't have the money to pay my workers. Over and over again, we hear him say that. We see it. He's panicked about it. We see he's worried about that. And while he's worried about that, he still buys Mary that necklace.
Right. That's right. You've heard people talk about retail therapy. I guess that's what what accounts for that.
Yeah.
But it was totally wrong of him, and she points it out, obviously.
And the
the
reason behind it was to show that he was in control and nothing was
Right.
wrong, when he was actually completely obliterating at the seams.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So then we go on to episode 6, where
I love that episode.
what's that?
I love that episode.
Oh, me too. And it is full of irony because of all the things that, I mean, the great thing about, I love about episode 6 is how they talk everything out,
Yeah.
in the carriage, and she continues to go after him, and he continues to defend himself and finally tell the truth about what's going on, really,
Mm-hmm.
in his life and who he is, and the irony in their positions, and obviously how he doesn't want to have her along, and she worms her way into
Mhm.
being along. And as we've talked about before, how ironic it is that her presence leads to finding Georgiana.
She is the reason why.
Mhm. Yeah.
And he
Yeah.
saw her as a hindrance in so many different levels. And she is the one thing about all this that makes sense.
Right. Right. Yeah. And all the things that she says that then he ironically comes back and pays attention to,
Mhm.
especially once they've found Georgiana, and when they're back in Bedford Place, in London, and before they go to the ball and everything.
Mhm.
Yeah, I don't have those conversations written down, but you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah, my favorite episode too. One of my favorite episodes, at least.
Mhm.
And the irony again at the ball,
Mhm.
and things are just finally smoothing out between them, and sort of Tom, why he always thinks that Eliza's a good solution, I have no idea. Seems to me like it's just because he knows she has money, I guess.
I don't think it's that. I think that he knows of their relationship, and it doesn't seem to me like Sydney really goes in depth with his feelings with Tom. So I think that what Tom knows of Sydney and Eliza is that they were deeply in love. And if she's back and she wants you her not being with you must be the reason you've been miserable this whole time. But now that she's back, you can go back to being in love again. So that's best for you, because you can go back to the guy you were, and it'll be great. It'll be happy, because Tom doesn't think beyond that, because I don't think that he is trusted with that kind of information from Sydney very often.
Yeah, he doesn't open himself up to it very often, when they finally have that conversation, and Sydney is like, I'll own my mistakes, but you need to own yours. I can't take yours. Yeah. But then that's when he tells her just how he feels about his wife, how much he would like to have a wife like yours, like Mary.
Yeah.
And, he's going to do what he can to help Tom. And, we'll get Babington on it, and I'll pay so you can pay the workers. I mean, all the things that Charlotte had said early on about how you don't do everything you can to help Tom.
Yeah.
Come to roost, and it's seen here, the irony between those events.
Yeah.
Even not just a conversation, events are ironic.
Yeah. And even though it was ironic, kind of, is that her saying, do everything you can to help Tom, but what he does in the end to help Tom is what separates them from each other.
Right.
And it was Charlotte's words who said, you don't do enough. So he did the ultimate thing, which ended up in both of their heartbreaks.
Right.
But I think too, it's not just an irony, but it's a foreshadowing too, and I've watched this scene over and over, because after you watch a show so many times, then you start to look at the background, you start to look at different things every time you watch it. So I started watching the background, and it is actually the very first time that Sydney breaks out into a full grin while dancing, and Eliza shows up in the background. And the fact that he just for the first time, and who knows how long, opened up to Tom about how much he wants a wife while dancing with the woman he's in love with. The moment he finds happiness, his old flame, who used to be happiness for him, appears. And that is just confirmation to Tom that look at all these things coming together for Sydney. Look at
Yeah,
it.
right. Because he's kind of oblivious. Yeah.
Mhm.
And Lady D's words about, you can't choose who you fall in love with, that in itself is irony.
Mhm.
And, just that whole conversation.
Yeah.
And then as they're talking about him, then he shows up
Yeah.
to ask her to dance. And also, when you think about the fact that
Oh, you mean
he's so
Susan, Lady
upset.
Susan. Okay.
I'm sorry, Lady Susan. What did I say?
I thought I heard Lady Deb, and I thought you were talking about the conversation between her and Esther at the card table.
No, I meant Lady Susan. I don't know what words I said, but I meant Lady Susan. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And also when you think about that whole episode and how Sydney was so upset with Otis and Georgiana for the danger she was put in,
Mhm.
because they were all after her money, and how upset he was about that all obviously Charlotte didn't realize that when they married, all the money became the man's. He was the one who controlled it. And then the whole overriding irony that that's what ends up happening for Sydney, which is one of the most heartbreaking things ever. Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah.
So should we talk about episode 7?
Yes. I like that you call them chapters. I think they should be called chapters. That's what we're called on a DVD, is they're called chapters.
There are chapters, even if they're episodes.
Exactly.
So in episode 7, of course, thanks to Lady Susan, we know this, and that whole conversation that Charlotte had. That's why the regatta becomes a success.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the filming ironies is that the river was actually a lake.
Yeah.
In real life, it's a lake. Yeah. But they did a good job of convincing us that it was a river in the filming of it, which was probably easier to control than if it had been a river.
Yeah.
But
I just love that conversation between Arthur and Diane when she's like, you get seasickness. It is the river.
Yeah, I love that one too. And just how Arthur goes and gets Georgiana out of her funk.
Yeah.
And gets her out,
There's so much to love.
Yeah, definitely. And I've been invaded. And so obviously the irony of them finally having gotten together in episode 6, only to have Eliza show up, and then Eliza comes to Sanditon and really treats Charlotte like she's nothing.
Yeah. Jealous rage.
Yeah. It's, and it still just bugs the heck out of me. I mean, I see why they did it, but that those two were not really formally introduced to each other. It's like, I just hate that when I'm in a situation and people don't introduce each other.
Yeah. And it's the irony there is that Sydney didn't introduce them because he's in love with Charlotte, but trying to give it a try with Eliza. But the very fact that he doesn't introduce it is what spurs her on to be jealous and be like, all right, there's something else going on here.
Yeah. And as we've talked about before, the whole irony of Eliza and Sydney walking over to the sandcastle competition, speaking with Charlotte, and then walking away, and Eliza saying she takes care of the children. Well, that and other things like, it just, in your head, it's so much more.
Yeah.
This whole regatta wouldn't exist if it wasn't for Charlotte.
Exactly.
It's like, and he points that out when he goes up to ask her a second time to come to the ball. That it's because of her. So it would be ironic if she didn't go. And it would have been a tragedy, as we find out, if she didn't go.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
and I think there too, that we can't ignore the deleted scene where it's filled with just one big ironic conversation between Eliza and Sydney. The whole reason she's pursuing him, the whole reason she wants him, the whole reason she's fighting to have him stay with her or not go with Charlotte is because she wants the boy he was and
Right.
believes he still is, but he's no longer one, he's no longer a boy. But
Yeah.
two, he's certainly nothing like who he was before.
He's not the same person. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. And that's why in episode 8, it's so hard to see them together at the wedding.
Yeah.
Just the demeanor and everything. It's not words, it's the demeanor between them.
Yeah. I think more than anything, what I grieve more than him not being with Charlotte is the fact that he's with Eliza.
Yeah, that character.
Because
Mhm.
Charlotte has hope. She can
Right.
find someone awesome. Sydney is doomed.
And if the story had continued with them, it would have been, even if they had gotten married, it would have been interesting to see how what he did to handle his situation after he was the man who now had the money. You know what I mean? But anyway, and so obviously the irony of them, the rowing scene when they're rowing together and then Eliza appears. Obviously the irony there is pretty thick.
Yeah.
And so anything else in chapter 7 you want to talk about?
I do want to go into a little more detail about that, because in the boat, you see that Sydney wants to find reasons to touch Charlotte. He wants to be physically and emotionally and mentally close to Charlotte. He's confessing things to her. That question about marriage is not something you just say to someone who's a flippant acquaintance. He's longing for that sort of mental intimacy, emotional intimacy with Charlotte that he doesn't really want from her. So the irony there is that he's in the boat with Charlotte, touching her, engrossed by her, but Eliza's all the way far away on shore, having to call out to Sydney
to interrupt him.
And that's well, I think the imagery there is that he's close to Charlotte and Eliza's far.
Yes,
he's connected to Charlotte, whereas Eliza is separated from him. There is no connection anymore. There's the distance there is insurmountable, whereas the closeness and connection between him and Charlotte is so present. Yet that's who he has to leave, and he has to go towards this one he has no connection with at all.
Right. And we see the contrast when he comes and talks to her in Trafalgar House at the end of the scene.
Yeah.
And the irony and what his attitude towards her is now in his words, in contrast to what he had said before on many occasions, on several occasions anyway.
Yeah. And just as what he did or didn't do, rather, what he didn't do with Charlotte in like introducing him to Eliza or introducing her to Eliza, talking about her with Eliza, explaining her to Eliza, as much as that spurred Eliza on to fighting for him and hating Charlotte, Eliza's attempts to sway Sydney to her side, ironically, are what pushed him closer to Charlotte. So both of them are constantly at opposing viewpoints, opposing ends, trying to fight for something that's opposite to what the other one wants.
Right.
But yet they both think that they're getting the right end of it.
And you really see that when she makes those really cutting comments to Charlotte in the tent with Lady Susan.
Yeah.
And then Sydney pursues her. And then at the same time, Stringer is watching all of that.
Hello, Stringer.
We haven't talked about it.
It's Stringer too who spurs Sydney into action. Stringer who wanted Charlotte. Stringer who made a play for Charlotte. Stringer who told her or tried to tell her without actually telling her how he felt.
Right.
He's the one who spurred Sydney to action by saying, "Not the prize I was after."
Right. Yeah.
And after that, the next thing we see with Sydney and Charlotte is Sydney saying goodbye to Eliza and Sydney running to Charlotte.
Yep. Yeah, it very well may have, it may have put him over the edge,
Yeah.
And then in chapter 8.
I always hate when we get to the end of talking about it. It just is so sad.
Yeah. One of the things I thought about was when Georgiana, when Charlotte comes and talks to Georgiana about what's going on with Sydney and what he said to her. And she says, he says he says to George, where is it? He says, men like you can't change. That's when Georgiana says it to Sydney.
That's when he goes up in there to talk with her, and I think it's right after in episode 7 is when it's said.
Okay.
He says, I will try to be better or something along those lines. And she says, men like you cannot change.
Right. Oh, yeah, that's right. He's trying
That's
to get
right
her
before
up.
he runs into
So it
Charlotte
is
in the
in
hallway.
7. Yeah, yeah. And he says, yes, and she is not willing to change. Georgia is saying Sydney can't change, but it's Georgia who isn't going to change.
Absolutely.
She's not changing her attitude, even after Sydney and Charlotte rescued her. I mean, Sydney risked his life jumping from one carriage to another to try and save her. And it's how tragic is it that he wasn't able to fulfill his change. He's the one who had changed.
Absolutely.
And how awful it is that he wasn't able to fulfill that change because of the fire.
And the other thing too is that when she's saying men like you cannot change, she's saying that because of the one who broke her heart, which is Otis. So essentially she's saying you and Otis are the same guy, but Otis is who she's absolutely in love with. And even episode 8, we see her looking at that locket before the ball of Otis.
Right.
So she's still longing for him, but the reason she's saying that is directly related to how she's currently feeling about Otis. So when she says men like you cannot change, she's lumping him and Otis in the same boat.
Yeah, that's right.
But Otis she loves, Sydney she doesn't.
Right. And really, as I said, she's the one who isn't changing.
Yeah,
regardless
absolutely.
of the facts and how she's being treated and all that stuff.
Which is by the way.
Yeah.
She's treated pretty darn well.
Yeah, exactly. He definitely takes care of her in ways she doesn't seem to recognize or appreciate.
And an obvious parallel here too is that we start this episode with obviously Charlotte walking along there, but when we first see an interaction with her and somebody else, it's between her and Sydney, as Sydney and Tom are surveying the beautifully finished building that they just did. That's going to save Sanditon. That's going to allow Sydney and Charlotte to be together. And we end the episode with the fire that's completely destroyed it, along with everybody else's hopes and dreams.
Yeah,
so, I mean, that parallel is so paramount that it's again life to death, beginning to end.
Yep. Yeah. Of course, there's the sort of the anticlimax after the fire. When he goes to London to try and save Sanditon.
Yeah.
And ironically ruins his own life.
Yeah.
So yeah, lots of contrast there, and ironies, and just the difference in the reaction when he comes back between, we've talked about before, the difference in the reaction when he comes back and how the family reacts versus how Sydney and Charlotte react. And then also at the fire, the people that jump in and start helping, of course, are Sydney and Charlotte and Arthur, and then the others that are just standing there, Tom and even Stringer, although Stringer's late to the show, but he still is standing there from all we can see, just watching the fire burn.
Yeah.
So
it's those who are not directly invested in it who are helping, and the ones who are directly invested in the livelihood of it who are so overcome that they can't do anything.
Right. And it's a matter of saving the town in addition to just the development, the new part. But yeah, it'll be interesting, really interesting to see where the story goes after this.
And I hope it has the same sort of build, because that's what keeps us engaged. And I guarantee it will, because it's the same writers who are working on it.
Yeah.
Have that structure of, like even in the beginning of episode 8, when they're standing in front of that building, admiring it, spending so much time, there's not really, I mean, Tom is talking because Tom is always talking, but you can't really hear what he's saying. You're not focused on those words, but you have this anticipation, seeing them look at this building and the focus be on that building for so long that, oh no, what's going to happen? Oh no, something's going to happen. You don't really you can't really think of what, but you just have this feeling something's going to happen because of the structure of it and the way that they write. And I know they're going to continue that into season 2.
Yeah. It'll be good.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So we're going to talk about, do you have anything else you want to say about Ironies and Parallels?
There's probably a lot we missed.
I'm
But there's
sure.
a lot in
Yeah,
the show.
there
We
is.
can't make a 4-hour episode on this.
No. Yeah. Yeah.
The next one in a
Anyway.
couple episodes, we'll do a parallel between this and Austen's other works.
Oh, sure. Okay. Yeah. I got some more reading to do.
Yes. Oh, I'm gonna focus a hyper amount on Pride and Prejudice and Sanditon.
Did you
That's my
see the
baby.
posting that the one of the gals who posts a lot on Sanditon to I don't know how you say her name, but anyway, she said that her husband was reading, he's about halfway through Pride and
He said, I
Prejudice.
don't understand what's happening.
Yeah. Yeah. That was
Her
No,
posts
that
always
was-
make me laugh. It's Osmond, I think is her last name. Is it Tahira
Yeah,
Osmond?
yeah, that sounds right.
I'll look it up and I'll put her Twitter handle in the comments of this. But if you don't follow her, she's a delight and she's always got something hilarious to say. I love that girl. I love listening.
And she
to
is a
her reading her stuff.
huge fan.
Yeah, huge fan.
Yeah. So yeah, it's fun.
So
But
next
that was
week
fun.
we'll be talking about our first fan fiction, and that will be we are going over it's what is her name? What is her name on Archive of Our Own? I can't remember.
Oh, I don't remember either.
Bath Time Regency or something to do with like Regency and Bath Time or something. I don't
Yeah,
remember.
Regency Bather. Or
Yes,
something
that's what
like
I think it's Regency Bather. But if you follow her on Twitter, her Twitter handle is Tiny Toes Tracy. So we are going over she's got one that she's currently working on called A Crow Encounter. And we will be discussing that kind of at the tail end because it's still a work in progress. And if you want to know more about this, reach out to her and she'll tag you in all the posts when she posts an update on Archive of Our Own. But we are going to be discussing at length her very first fan fiction that she wrote when Sanditon first ended. So go look that up. Again, if you don't know what we're talking about, I'll put a link to it in the description of this podcast. You can go search her Twitter handle, which is Tiny Toes Tracy, and get her link from there. If you want to read it and be prepared for our discussion next week on that. And I think that's going to be it for this week.
Okay.
If you want to hear more from us, you can find us in our Facebook group of the Sanditon Chronicles, Sanditon Family Fan Club. You can find us Instagram and Twitter under the Sanditon Chronicles. And you can email us at the.sanditonchronicles@gmail.com if you have things you want to say.
Great.
And then we'll see you in a week. Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.